You ever notice how some folks, they build their own prisons? Not with concrete and steel, not with bars and guards, but with whispers. Little voices in their head telling them what they can't do, what they shouldn't be. Whispers born of imagined glares and unspoken jokes. They lock away their truest selves, their deepest longings, all for the fear of a raised eyebrow, a dismissive chuckle. They walk around day in, day out, carrying this invisible weight, believing that keeping themselves small, keeping themselves hidden is the only safe way to live. They become experts at blending in, at fading into the background, until the background itself starts to feel like a cage. And the key is usually in their own pocket, if only they dared to reach for it. Vernon was one of those men. 43 years old, built from the kind of silent grit that holds up old bridges and keeps rusty gears turning. He was a factory man, through and through, the kind you'd see wiping grease from his brow on a scorching summer day or hunching against the wind in the dead of winter, always doing what needed doing. His name, Vernon, it fit him like an old, reliable work boot, solid, unpretentious, made for walking long, hard roads without complaint. Look at him closely and you wouldn't see much that screamed for attention. He wasn't tall, wasn't short, wasn't broad, wasn't slight. He was just Vernon. His skin, though, that told a story, weathered brown, etched with a network of fine lines around his eyes and mouth like maps of silent thoughts and unvoiced efforts. Those hands, though, those were his masterpiece. Knuckles swollen slightly, fingers scarred and calloused, nails always a little rough, even after scrubbing. They were the hands of a man who'd spent decades coaxing metal into submission, tightening bolts, wrestling with heavy machinery. Hands that knew the feel of cold steel and hot oil better than they knew the soft touch of anything else. They were strong, capable, the kind of hands that could fix almost anything, but also, surprisingly, possessed a quiet grace when he was just stirring his coffee or picking up a dropped coin. His eyes, beneath thick, sandy brows, were a faded blue. They held a deep, observational stillness like a pond on a windless morning. You'd think they were tired, and they often were, but there was more there than just fatigue. A watchfulness, a habit of taking things in without giving much back. He wasn't rude, not at all, just private. Most folks at the plant, they knew Vernon as the quiet guy, the dependable one who always nodded instead of talking, who you could count on to show up, do his job right, and keep himself to himself. They saw stoicism, maybe a touch of reserve, but never anything that suggested the surprising depth coiled up behind that quiet gaze. He was good at his job, meticulous in a way that often went unnoticed, like the perfectly aligned gears in a machine everyone just assumed would always work. And that suited him just fine. Blending in was his specialty, his shield, his self-made prison cell. Those were his masterpiece. Knuckles swollen slightly, fingers scarred and calloused, nails always a little rough, even after scrubbing. They were the hands of a man who'd spent decades coaxing metal into submission, tightening bolts, wrestling with heavy machinery. Hands that knew the feel of cold steel and hot oil better than they knew the soft touch of anything else. They were strong, capable, the kind of hands that could fix almost anything, but also, surprisingly, possessed a quiet grace when he was just stirring his coffee or picking up a dropped coin. His eyes, beneath thick, sandy brows, were a faded blue. They held a deep, observational stillness like a pond on a windless morning. You'd think they were tired, and they often were, but there was more there than just fatigue. A watchfulness. A habit of taking things in without giving much back. He wasn't rude, not at all. Just private. Most folks at the plant, they knew Vernon as the quiet guy, the dependable one who always nodded instead of talking, who you could count on to show up, do his job right, and keep himself to himself. They saw stoicism, maybe a touch of reserve, but never anything that suggested the surprising depth coiled up behind that quiet gaze. He was good at his job, meticulous in a way that often went unnoticed, like the perfectly aligned gears in a machine everyone just assumed would always work. And that suited him just fine. Blending in was his specialty, his shield, his self-made prison cell. There was a man once, just like you or me perhaps, who carried a heavy chain. Not one of iron, not one that clanked loud for all the world to hear, but a quieter kind, forged in the fear of what others might think. He built his own cage, brick by careful brick, out of what if they laugh? And what if I fail? And what if they see? He thought he was protecting himself, keeping ridicule at bay, but all he was really doing was locking away the very thing that made him him. He wasn't alone in that prison, mind you. Many of us are cellmates, staring out through bars of our own making, watching life pass by, convinced the outside world holds only judgment, when sometimes, just sometimes, all it holds is a little bit of light. His name was Vernon. He was 43, though the years etched around his eyes sometimes whispered of more. Vernon worked the night shift at the old industrial plant on the edge of town, the one everyone just called the mill, even though it hadn't milled anything but parts for heavy machinery in decades. The air inside always smelled of ozone, oil, and the faint metallic tang of effort. He was a factory man, through and through, like his father before him and his father's father. A reliable cog in a vast, grinding machine, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Or at least how he convinced himself he wanted it. His days were a silent testament to routine, a careful choreography designed to avoid notice. Wake up before dawn, the weak light barely piercing the dusty blinds of his modest, 70s-built house. Coffee black. A quick scan of the local paper's headlines, never lingering, never engaging. The drive to the plant, the same route, the same radio station playing old rock ballads he barely heard. Then the shift. 8 hours of focused, methodical work, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, honed by years of repetition. He was good, genuinely good at spotting a misaligned gear, hearing the subtle change in a bearing's whine before anyone else. He was the kind of worker managers valued but rarely saw, because he never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn, never made waves. He was the quiet current beneath the surface, steady and strong, but utterly unseen. This quietness, this dedication to being unremarkable, wasn't accidental. It was Vernon's armor, painstakingly crafted over decades. Inside him, beneath the stoic facade, was a deep, gnawing fear. Not of failure itself, not exactly, but of the laughter that might follow it. The pointed stares, the whispered jokes, the sudden, sharp silence that signaled he'd done something different, something wrong. He'd seen it happen to others, the way a man could be reduced to a caricature just for wearing the wrong hat, or trying something new that didn't quite work out. The sting of ridicule, even imagined, felt like a physical threat, a burning ember under his skin that kept him perpetually wary. He remembered a time, long ago, when he'd sketched fanciful designs in the margins of his school notebooks, dreaming of building things that weren't just practical but beautiful. He'd even shown one, a detailed drawing of a carved wooden box with intricate inlays, to his older sister once. She'd laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "What's this nonsense, Vernon? Are you trying to be an artist? Get real, we're factory folk." The memory of that laugh, innocent as it might have been from a teasing sibling, had burrowed deep, confirming his deepest fear. That his own desires, his own particular brand of yearning for creative expression, were foolish, impractical, worthy only of derision. So he built his wall higher, bricked in every impulse that strayed from the normal path. He became what others expected, the dependable, quiet factory man. He dismissed his own desires as silly, unimportant, the kind of frivolous thoughts a sensible man shouldn't entertain. He kept his head down, his observations to himself, his imagination locked away behind steel doors. The vulnerability he felt, that quiet ache to create, to connect through something he made with his own hands, was fiercely guarded, a secret shame he carried alone. It was easier, he told himself, to be invisible than to be laughed at. Safer to be a shadow than to cast a light that might draw unwanted attention. The world outside his modest house and the factory floor was a maze of potential judgments, and Vernon had learned, very early on, that the best way to navigate it was not to move at all, to simply blend into the background until he became part of the scenery. The world outside his modest house and the factory floor was a maze of potential judgments, and Vernon had learned very early on that the best way to navigate it was not to move at all, to simply blend into the background until he became part of the scenery. Every morning, the digital banshee shrieked at 5 a.m. Vernon's hand, calloused and thick-fingered, found the snooze button with practiced efficiency, a ritual as ingrained as breathing. He didn't want to be awake. Not yet. But the factory clock waited for no man, and neither did the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. He'd swing his feet to the cold linoleum, the chill a sharp reminder of the day's obligations, then shuffle to the bathroom. The mirror showed a face that was more a landscape than a portrait, lines etched around eyes that had seen too many early dawns, a jaw set firm against the world's quiet pressures. A man built for endurance, not for flourish. Breakfast was always the same. Black coffee, toast, sometimes a boiled egg if he felt fancy. He'd eat in silence, the only sound the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant rumble of the city stirring. The small living room, neat as a pin, offered little comfort beyond its predictability. A news anchor droned softly from the television, a distant voice cataloging other people's problems, problems that felt a world away from Vernon's own, yet somehow just as pressing. The drive to the plant was a blur of familiar streets under a bruised sky, the air still tasting of night and exhaust fumes. He'd park in the same spot, walk the same path, nod to the same faces. Inside, the factory floor was a symphony of industrial noise. The metallic shriek of presses, the rhythmic clank of conveyor belts, the guttural roar of furnaces. Vernon's job was in assembly, a position that demanded precision and repetition. Day in, day out, he fastened component A to component B, then passed it down the line. His hands, usually so deliberate and capable, moved with a detached efficiency, muscle memory taking over, leaving his mind free to wander, though it rarely did. Wandering invited dangerous thoughts, thoughts that could disrupt the careful order he'd built. The pay was decent enough to keep the wolves from the door, but not much more. The roof needed patching, the ancient hot water heater groaned like a dying beast, and property taxes always seemed to climb higher than the cost of living. There was no room for error, no room for extravagance, and certainly no room for hobbies that didn't pay. Every penny had a destination, a purpose. His life was a ledger, balanced precariously, and any deviation, any unexpected expense could send it all tumbling. But beneath the stoic exterior, beneath the methodical movements of the factory man, a different Vernon existed, a man quietly suffocating. He'd sometimes catch himself staring at a knot in the cheap pine of a pallet, seeing not just a flaw, but a story, a pattern. His fingers would twitch, remembering the feel of good hardwood, the smooth glide of a chisel. The garage, a place of practical storage for tools and an old lawnmower, held another secret. Carefully stacked planks of cherry, walnut, and maple, each piece a whispered promise he couldn't bring himself to break entirely. Hidden beneath drop cloths and old blankets were the results of those whispers. Delicate bird carvings, small, intricate boxes with dovetail joints so tight they seemed to be a single piece of wood, even a half-finished rocking horse, its graceful lines a stark contrast to the rough concrete floor. These were his forbidden treasures, his secret shame. They represented the gap, a yawning chasm between the man he presented to the world and the man he yearned to be. He told himself it was foolishness, a waste of time and perfectly good wood. A grown man pushing 50, messing around with toys. He could almost hear his sister's laugh, sharp and dismissive, echoing in the quiet solitude of his mind. It was this internalized ridicule that was the cruelest warden. He didn't need anyone else to laugh, he did it to himself. He'd pick up a finely carved piece, admire the grain, the way the light caught the curve, and then almost instantly a cold wave of self-consciousness would wash over him. What's the point, Vernon? Who's gonna see it? Who's gonna care? They'll think you've gone soft in the head. He kept them hidden not just from others, but almost from himself, pushing the desire down, burying it under the weight of practicality and perceived judgment. The quiet yearning for creative expression was a burden, a secret illness that made him feel different, weak, and strangely unmanly in the world of wrenches and steel. It was easier to be invisible, easier to be the dependable, quiet factory man, than to risk the sting of ridicule for daring to create something beautiful and, to his mind, utterly useless. Each day he felt himself shrinking a little more, the vibrant colors of his hidden passions fading to gray beneath the relentless march of conformity. It was a Tuesday, a regular Tuesday, the kind that bled into Wednesday without much distinction. The air in the factory cafeteria was thick with the smell of reheating leftovers and stale coffee, a low hum of machinery just audible beneath the clatter of forks on plates. Vernon sat alone at his usual table in the corner, methodically eating his ham sandwich, the bread a little too soft from being packed hours ago. His eyes, as always, swept over the room, observing, taking everything in without seeming to. Today, however, there was a new face, fresh scrubbed and eager, sitting a few tables over with a group of younger guys. Kid named Marcus just started last week, straight out of trade school. Full of questions, full of talk. Vernon had given him his standard quiet nod when introduced. Marcus, it turned out, was the kind of young man who saw the world with wide-open eyes, unburdened by the cynicism that age often brings. As Vernon reached for his thermos, his elbow nudged his lunchbox, knocking it slightly askew. A small, unfinished piece of wood, a bird no bigger than his thumb, tumbled out and rolled a few inches across the table before hitting the worn metal edge of his tray. He froze, a spike of cold dread shooting through him. He'd been working on it last night, smoothing a wing, and in his tired rush this morning, he'd forgotten it was still in the lunchbox. Of all the dumb things, his heart pounded a little faster, anticipating the inevitable. He braced himself for a snicker, a raised eyebrow, a dismissive chuckle from one of the young bucks. He imagined the words, "What's that, Vernon, playing with dollhouses now?" or lost your marbles, old man. He was already formulating his casual, dismissive reply, something about it being for his imaginary niece, a joke to deflect the perceived ridicule. He slowly reached for the bird, ready to scoop it up and hide it away to bury the shame before it could fully bloom. But the laugh never came. Instead, a voice, clear and curious, cut through the cafeteria drone. "Hey, mister," Vernon, Marcus called out, not unkindly. Is that a bird?" Vernon looked up, surprised that the sound had come from Marcus. The kid pushed back his chair and walked over, a half-eaten burrito still in his hand. He leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed on the tiny wooden form. "Man, that's really intricate. Did you make that?" Vernon felt a peculiar sensation. It wasn't the burning humiliation he'd steeled himself for. It was genuine, unadulterated curiosity. Marcus's brow was furrowed, not in judgment, but in concentration, admiring the delicate curve of the bird's beak, the unfinished but clearly sculpted tail feathers. There was no mockery in his voice, no hint of a sneer, just a simple, earnest question. "Yeah," Vernon mumbled, the word feeling stiff on his tongue, unused to such an admission. He picked up the bird, turning it in his fingers, suddenly self-conscious, but also, strangely, a little seen. "Oh," Marcus said, his voice quiet now, almost reverent. "That's really cool. You make stuff like that often?" He wasn't laughing. He wasn't scoffing. He wasn't even questioning Vernon's masculinity or sanity. He was just looking, genuinely impressed. The kid simply stood there, waiting for an answer, his eyes reflecting a clean, uncritical admiration. In that moment, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the thick, reinforced wall Vernon had built around himself. A sliver of light, unexpected and gentle, pierced through the darkness of his fear. It wasn't a grand revelation, not a choir of angels, but a soft whisper of possibility, a realization that the ridicule he'd feared so vehemently was, at least in this instance, entirely absent. The kid wasn't laughing. He was just admiring. That night, Vernon found himself wide awake at 3 o'clock in the morning. The house was utterly still, save for the soft hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. He lay on his back in the darkness, staring at the ceiling he couldn't see, his mind a relentless projector replaying the cafeteria scene. "Did you make that?" Marcus's voice echoed in the cavernous silence of his bedroom. "That's really cool." He rolled over, punched his pillow into a more comfortable position, but comfort was a foreign concept tonight. A brutal honesty, sharp as a fresh chisel, began to carve its way through his carefully constructed defenses. What had he been doing? 43 years old, and he was living a life dictated by the imaginary opinions of others. He worked hard, paid his bills, kept his lawn tidy. He was reliable, dependable, invisible. Was that it? Was that the sum total of Vernon Hayes? He thought of the stacks of lumber in his garage, the half-finished projects gathering dust, the intricate, beautiful pieces locked away in an old chest. The miniature lighthouse with its spiraling staircase he'd spent weeks on, the delicate wooden flowers that looked impossibly real, the animals carved with such love and precision, all hidden, all unseen, all because of a fear so ingrained, so primal, that it felt like an essential part of his DNA. A fear that someone somewhere would point and laugh at his fanciful hobby, at his useless creations. But Marcus hadn't laughed. He admired. A wave of profound regret washed over him, cold and heavy. He'd spent decades pushing down that yearning, silencing that creative voice, burying it under the weight of perceived judgment. He allowed himself to shrink, to fade, to become the unassuming, stoic factory man everyone expected. He'd convinced himself that keeping his passions hidden was strength, a pragmatic choice. But tonight, in the suffocating quiet of his bedroom, it felt like nothing but cowardice. What had his life become? A long, monotonous march from one workday to the next, punctuated only by the brief respite of evenings spent alone, either nursing a beer in front of the TV or, more often, toiling in secret in his garage, only to hide the fruits of his labor again. He'd chosen invisibility over vulnerability, safety over expression. And what had it gained him? Solitude, certainly. Security from ridicule, perhaps. But at what cost? He felt a gaping hole inside him, an emptiness that no amount of dependability or silence could fill. He was a man with hands capable of creating beauty, a mind full of intricate designs, and a soul yearning to express itself, yet he'd chained himself to a self-imposed prison of fear. The thought was unbearable, a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could rewind time, wishing he could tell that younger Vernon to just show something, anything. Just once, just to see what would happen. The truth, stark and unforgiving, hammered him. The greatest judge, the most brutal critic, the most relentless warden had always been himself. That realization, sharp as splintered oak, often hit him hardest in the dead of night. But usually he'd push it down, bury it under the blankets, tell himself it was foolish thinking. He was a practical man. Yet sometimes something small, something utterly unexpected, could chip away at the fortress he'd built around himself, letting in a sliver of light he didn't even know he'd been craving. It happened a Tuesday, humid and thick, the kind of day the factory air hung heavy with the smell of metal and sweat. Lunch break. Vernon sat on his usual bench, tucked away in a corner of the noisy break room, picking at a sandwich his tired hands had assembled that morning. His lunchbox, a dented metal affair that had seen more years than most marriages, was open beside him. He wasn't paying much attention, just methodically eating, his gaze lost somewhere between the chipped paint on the wall and the ceaseless chatter of his younger colleagues. Then a shadow fell over his bench. He looked up. It was Leo, the new kid. 22, maybe 23, fresh out of trade school, all wide eyes and boundless energy. He was the kind of kid who still believed every problem had a solution and every day was a chance to learn something. Vernon usually offered him a grunt or a nod. Today, Leo was looking not at Vernon, but at something in his open lunchbox. Vernon followed his gaze. There, nestled amongst an apple and a packet of saltines, was a small, half-finished wooden sparrow. Its delicate wings were barely sketched, its head just beginning to take shape, smooth, pale pine. He'd forgotten it was there, had been sanding it in the garage the night before, restless, and must have tossed it in with his lunch instead of putting it back on his workbench. A mistake. A terrible, public mistake. His heart gave a cold, hard lurch. He braced himself for the inevitable smirk, the good-natured but cutting joke about him playing with dolls, or worse, making little birdhouses for fairies. That old familiar tightness started in his chest, but Leo didn't smirk. He didn't even smile. He just leaned in, his brow furrowed in genuine curiosity, his eyes scanning the nascent form of the bird. "Whoa," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent above the din. Did you make that, Vernon?" Vernon managed a strangled, "Yeah." His voice felt like gravel. He wanted to snatch the bird, hide it, make it disappear. He waited for the punchline. Leo reached out a careful finger, tracing the smooth, unpolished curve of its back. "Man," he breathed, that's really something. The way you got the tail feather to just flow, you do a lot of stuff like this." His eyes, when they met Vernon's, held no trace of mockery, only admiration, unfiltered, uncritical admiration. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Vernon felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, like a single, fragile crack appearing in a wall he'd thought impenetrable. It wasn't ridicule. It was wonder, from a kid who had no reason to flatter him. It was a simple question, but it hit him like a physical blow, vibrating through his very bones. His throat felt thick. He just nodded again, unable to speak, the unexpected lightness of the moment almost unbearable. The rest of the workday blurred. The rhythmic clang of machinery, the shouts of supervisors, the familiar patterns of bolts and welds, it all receded into a dull hum. Leo's words echoed in his head, not just the, "That's really something," but the way he'd said it, the honest surprise in his voice. It wasn't the kind of compliment Vernon had ever allowed himself to imagine. It was pure. That night, Vernon didn't just lie awake. He woke up at 3 a.m. with a jolt, the silence of his modest house pressing in on him. He sat upright in bed, heart hammering against his ribs, sweat cooling on his forehead. The image of that small wooden bird, the genuine awe in Leo's young eyes, was burned into his mind. And then the dam broke. He hadn't been laughing. He hadn't been judging. He'd just seen it and liked it. A brutal honesty, raw and unflinching, seized Vernon. His breath hitched. All these years, all this careful hiding, all this self-imposed silence and fear of ridicule, it had been a ghost. A monster he'd created himself and then allowed to stand guard over his life. He saw it all laid out, stark and unforgiving. The meticulously crafted pieces hidden in dusty corners of his garage, the designs sketched on napkins that never saw the light of day, the quiet yearning for something more than just putting in his time at the factory. He had been so utterly convinced that vulnerability was weakness, that showing a piece of his true self would expose him to scorn. He had built his own cage, locked himself in, and thrown away the key, all based on a fear that today had proven to be little more than a whisper. What had his life become? A perfectly contained, predictable, joyless existence. He saw the years stretching behind him, a long, gray tunnel. He saw the years stretching ahead, promising more of the same unless something fundamentally shifted. He had traded potential for perceived safety, authenticity for invisibility. And the cost? It was everything. a life unlived, a soul unexpressed. The truth was, Leo's compliment wasn't just about a bird. It was a tiny, hopeful crack in the very foundation of Vernon's self-made prison. And in the brutal honesty of that 3 a.m. darkness, Vernon finally understood that he was the only one holding the keys. He lay there, not moving a muscle, listening to the hum of his refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog. The brutal honesty persisted, hanging in the air like the metallic tang of ozone after a storm. And then a quiet resolve, unhurried but firm, began to settle in his bones. It wasn't a roar, not even a shout, but a whisper so clear, so undeniable, that it resonated through every tired cell in his body. Enough. Enough of the careful invisibility. Enough of the self-imposed exile. Enough of letting a phantom audience dictate the script of his existence. He didn't know what came next. He had no grand plan, no sudden vision of a life transformed into something unrecognizable. The thought of change, even a tiny one, was still terrifying. His stomach tightened, a familiar knot of apprehension coiling in his gut. But the terror of continuing down the same long, gray tunnel, of facing another decade of quiet despair, that was now a deeper, colder fear. He had seen the cost of his caution, and it was too high. He pushed himself up, swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold beneath his feet. He didn't turn on a light. In the dim pre-dawn quiet, Vernon made a silent pact with the man in the mirror, the man he had kept hidden for so long. He just knew with a certainty that was both chilling and liberating that he would not live another day exactly the same as the last. The next morning, the Tuesday after Leo's innocent compliment, felt heavy as if the air itself was denser. Vernon went through the motions of his routine. The 5 a.m. alarm, the strong black coffee, the careful packing of his lunch. But there was a difference, a tremor almost imperceptible under the surface of his practiced calm. In his garage, nestled amongst the larger unfinished projects, sat the small wooden bird, the one Leo had seen. It was a simple piece, a wren carved from a block of salvaged cherry wood, its feathers etched with delicate precision, its tiny, hopeful eye a bead of dark glass. He picked it up. His thumb stroked the smooth, cool wood. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave it there, to forget this foolish impulse, to fall back into the comforting, suffocating familiarity of silence. His hand hesitated over his lunchbox. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear. "They'll laugh," the old voice hissed, insidious and familiar. "What's a grown man doing with a little wooden bird? You're a factory worker, Vernon, not some artist." He pictured the looks, the snickers, the casual dismissal. He could almost hear the words. The shame, hot and immediate, threatened to overwhelm him, to make him shove the bird back onto the workbench and slam the garage door shut on this whole crazy idea. But then he remembered Leo's wide-eyed curiosity, the genuine admiration in the kid's voice. No laughter, no judgment, just a simple question. "You make stuff like that?" With a breath that felt like it had been pulled from the bottom of a well, Vernon carefully placed the small wooden bird in his lunchbox, nestled it beside his sandwich and apple. He didn't wrap it. He didn't try to hide it. He closed the lid with a definitive click. It was a small act, almost absurd in its simplicity, but it felt like dismantling a barricade with his bare hands. The drive to the factory was a blur of nervous energy. Every passing car seemed to eye him. Every stoplight felt like an interrogation. He imagined everyone knew he had a bird in his lunchbox, knew he was doing something different. The parking lot, usually a place of mindless routine, felt like a gauntlet. He walked with his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the ground, the weight of the lunchbox feeling heavier than any toolbox he'd ever carried. Inside, the bird sat, a small, carved challenge to his decades of fear. This was it, the first step. And it hurt like hell. The first lunch break arrived, a bell sounding like a prison release. Vernon walked to his usual table, a quiet corner away from the boisterous younger crew, his lunchbox clutched tighter than normal. He set it down, the plastic clatter sounding unnervingly loud in his ears. He glanced around. No one was looking at him, not really. Just the usual factory chatter, the clang of cutlery, the rumble of vending machines. He sat staring at the lid of his lunchbox as if it held a live grenade. Leo, the young hire, waved from a few tables over, then turned back to his conversation. He hadn't seen it. Not yet. The wave of relief was immediate, followed by a deeper, more unsettling wave of disappointment. Had he gone through all that anxiety for nothing? For an unobserved act of rebellion? Vernon picked at his sandwich, the food tasting like ash. He didn't open the compartment with the bird. He couldn't, not today. He ate quickly, packed his empty box, and headed back to the floor, a hollow victory ringing in his chest. The bird was safe, hidden, his secret still guarded. But the weight of it, the dread of discovery, was heavier than ever. That night the garage offered no sanctuary. He stared at the half-finished pieces, the tools, the fragrant sawdust, and felt only disgust. What was he doing? Pretending to be someone he wasn't. Chasing a foolish dream that would only bring him ridicule. He picked up the small wooden bird he'd brought home, tracing its smooth back with a calloused thumb. It was delicate, fanciful, everything a man like him wasn't supposed to be. He almost threw it into the kindling bin, almost gave up entirely, the shame curdling in his gut. But then he remembered Leo's face, unmarred by judgment. He remembered the feeling, however fleeting, of a tiny crack in his self-imposed prison. He set the bird down carefully, a silent truce with his own fear, and went to bed. Day 3, he brought the bird again. This time he opened the lunchbox and nudged the small wooden shape partly into view, nestled beside his apple, just a little. He kept his eyes down, eating every nerve ending screaming. No one said anything. The guys talked about the game last night, about a busted pipe on the third line. He felt like an invisible man watching a play from behind a glass wall. The fear didn't lessen, it just sharpened into a constant, low-frequency hum. The absence of negative reaction was almost as unsettling as the fear of it. Was he so uninteresting that no one even noticed? Or were they just too polite to laugh to his face? He clenched his jaw. This was harder than he thought. It was exhausting. By day 7, Vernon was tired. Not just factory floor tired, but bone-deep soul tired. Every morning was a new argument with himself in front of the lunchbox. Just stop, Vernon. This is pointless. No one cares. You're just making yourself miserable. He hadn't shared any more pieces. He hadn't actively shown the bird to Leo. He just kept bringing it, a silent, internal act of defiance that felt increasingly futile. He was like a soldier fighting a war entirely within his own head, the enemy a phantom constructed of past hurts and imagined future slights. The bird in his lunchbox had become less a symbol of hope and more a burden, a heavy, tiny cross he carried. He considered leaving it at home just one day, just to feel the relief, to go back to being Vernon, the quiet, dependable factory worker. The thought was tempting, a soft bed calling after a long shift. But then an image flashed in his mind. His younger self sketching designs on scrap paper, the joy of creation before the world taught him to hide. The quiet satisfaction of shaping wood, of bringing something beautiful into being. He thought of the decades he'd spent pushing that down, the way his spirit had slowly calcified. If he stopped now, he knew it would be permanent. The door would clang shut, locked from the inside, and he'd never even tried the handle. On day 14, something shifted. Vernon was at his workbench during lunch, fixing a faulty clamp for a colleague when Leo walked by. The kid stopped, leaned against the bench, and watched him work. "That's some good handiwork, Vernon," Leo said genuinely. "Always thought you had an eye for detail." Vernon grunted, a usual response, but then something made him pause. He looked at Leo, really looked. The kid was leaning closer, a casual, friendly presence. And then Leo's gaze drifted to the corner of Vernon's lunchbox, where the small wooden bird, now a familiar passenger, sat peeking out. Leo's eyes widened, a small smile playing on his lips. "Hey," he said quietly, a hint of recognition in his voice. "Is that?" Vernon's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment. His throat tightened. He braced himself for the smirk, the polite but condescending curiosity, the eventual laugh. But it didn't come. Leo just nodded, a knowing, approving nod, then looked back at Vernon, a quiet question in his eyes. He didn't say anything else, just held Vernon's gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement, a shared secret between two men who understood something without needing words. And in that silent exchange, something clicked in Vernon. The ridicule he'd been fighting for 2 weeks, the laughter he'd been dreading for a lifetime, it wasn't there. It had never been there. It had only been in his head, a ghost of a fear haunting a man who had forgotten how to live. The realization wasn't a thunderclap, more like a slow, quiet dawn. Vernon felt the tension leave his shoulders, a decades-old knot loosening inch by painful inch. He looked at Leo, really looked, and saw not a kid waiting to judge, but a young man waiting to connect. You really make these?" Leo asked, his voice soft, almost reverent, as his gaze fell back on the tiny bird. Vernon swallowed. His throat was still dry, but not from fear, from the sheer weight of possibility. He managed a short, gruff, "Yeah, sometimes." Leo picked up the bird, turning it gently in his large, calloused fingers. "This detail, Vernon, the feathers, the way the head tilts, it's really something." He looked up, a genuine smile on his face. "You got more of these?" That question, simple as it was a hammer blow against the last brittle walls Vernon had built around himself. "Got a garage full." he heard himself say, surprised by the words, and then a tremor of excitement. Boxes of 'em? Projects. Leo whistled low. You ought to show 'em off, man. Seriously, people'd eat this up. He gave the bird back to Vernon, a look of profound respect on his face. My old man, he tinkers. Nothing like this, but I know good work when I see it. That was the first crack in the concrete. The next morning, Vernon did something he'd never done. He brought a small wooden owl, perfectly balanced, carved from a piece of reclaimed oak, and left it on his workbench. Not hidden, not tucked away, just there, right next to his worn-out lunch pail. He waited for the comments, the raised eyebrows, the quiet snickers. He waited for old Manelli to walk by and make some crack about fancy-pants hobbies. He waited for the other guys to wonder why Vernon, dependable, stoic Vernon, was suddenly dabbling in such delicate things. But nobody said a damn thing. Not at first. Old Manelli grunted about the drill press, same as always. Frank asked if he had a spare wrench. The rhythm of the factory hummed on, oblivious to the small, wooden sentinel on Vernon's bench. And in that ordinary indifference, Vernon found a strange, liberating peace. They weren't judging. They just didn't care, not in a mean way, just in a mind-your-own-business kind of way that was, for Vernon, a blessing. Then Leo walked by, his eyes snagged on the owl. He stopped, picked it up, weighing it in his hand. Vernon, he said, a quiet awe in his voice. This is incredible, better than the bird even. This time, Vernon didn't just grunt. He felt a warmth spread through him. Thanks, kid. He mumbled, a small, genuine smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. It was a smile nobody at the factory had ever seen. Word got around slowly, like sawdust drifting on a breeze, not through Vernon boasting, but through Leo's quiet enthusiasm. You gotta see what Vernon made, he'd whisper to a buddy. He's got these carvings. Soon a few more guys would drift by Vernon's bench during break, their eyes falling on the latest piece Vernon had almost casually. Forgot to put away. Some would nod. Some would say, nice work, Vernon. Some would just stare, a silent appreciation passing between them and the wood. Nobody laughed. Nobody mocked. There was no ridicule. There was just a quiet, unassuming interest, sometimes even respect. Vernon started changing. Not dramatically, not overnight. Bags under his eyes were still there, the weariness of 43 years of heavy lifting. But something in his gaze had softened. He'd catch a guy's eye and offer a small, genuine smile instead of just a nod. He started talking, too. Not about his carvings right away, but about the weather, about the broken conveyor belt, about the upcoming playoff game. Small things, human things. The silence in his home, which once felt like a hollow echo of his own unspoken life, now felt different. It was still quiet, but it was a productive quiet. The garage light burned later into the night. The scent of sawdust mingled with the smell of brewing coffee in the mornings. His hands, once just tools for the factory floor, now felt like extensions of a different kind of purpose. He wasn't just making pieces, he was making himself. One Saturday, Leo showed up at Vernon's garage, unannounced, carrying a flat of beer. Heard you were thinking about that craft fair down by the old mill, Leo said, leaning against the doorframe, a casual confidence in his posture. Figured you could use a hand packing some of this up. Vernon stared, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The craft fair. The one he dismissed as a crazy notion, a foolish dream for a factory man. He'd meticulously finished a dozen small pieces, beautiful birds, intricate geometric designs, a stunning, lifelike fox head. They were all wrapped in old newspapers, tucked into boxes, but the thought of actually selling them, of putting them out for public scrutiny, still tied his gut in knots. I don't know, Leo, Vernon mumbled, looking at the boxes, then at his workbench, anywhere but the kid's expectant face. What don't you know? Leo pushed off the doorframe, picked up a box. That these are incredible, that people will love 'em, that you deserve to show 'em off. He looked Vernon in the eye. You came this far, Vernon. Don't stop now because you're scared of what people who don't even know you might think. And just like that, the familiar fear tried to resurface, but it felt weaker. A distant echo, not a roar. Vernon took a deep breath. All right, kid, he said, a tremor in his voice, but a determined glint in his eyes. Let's do it. The craft fair was a blur of faces, music, and the smell of kettle corn. Vernon stood behind a modest table covered with a worn sheet, his wooden pieces arranged carefully. His stomach was a drum solo. He barely made eye contact, staring instead at a knot in the wood of his table. Then a woman stopped. She picked up the wooden fox head, her fingers tracing its contours. This is exquisite, she said, her voice soft. How much? Vernon looked up. Her eyes were kind, no judgment, just admiration. He stammered a price. She bought it. And then another, and another. People came, they looked, they admired. Some bought, some just said, "Beautiful work." A few even complimented him, the man who made them. He found himself talking, explaining the different woods, the tools he used, the inspiration behind a piece. He heard his own voice, steady and clear, no longer a mumbled grunt. He didn't make a fortune that day, but he made something far more valuable. He made a connection. With strangers, with his craft, and most importantly, with himself. He saw his pieces through their eyes, and what he saw wasn't foolishness but beauty. He wasn't a factory worker hiding a secret hobby. He was Vernon, a man who built things, who created beauty, and who was, finally, willing to share it with the world. The small garden in front of his house, once just a chore, now had a new resident. A small, intricate wooden birdhouse, hanging proudly from the oak tree, a testament to a quiet victory. His house still stood in a working-class suburb, still built in the 70s, but it felt warmer, fuller. Vernon still went to the factory every day, still worked hard, still came home tired. But the burden on his shoulders was lighter. The silence in his head, the one that used to scream failure and ridicule, had been replaced by a quiet hum of purpose, a steady beat of self-acceptance. He found himself looking forward to the garage, to the sawdust, to the next piece. And sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the window and he'd see it. The same man, yes, but with new eyes. Eyes that held a quiet confidence, eyes that finally saw himself, not as others might judge him, but as he truly was, a creator. A man who had found his shape, piece by painstaking piece. Weeks later, the hum of the factory seemed to sync with the quiet rhythm Vernon had found. Mike, the young hire, stopped him near the punch clock. "Vernon, that birdhouse is a hit. My neighbor wants one just like it. Said your work has real soul." Vernon just nodded, but a genuine warmth spread through him. He'd started offering small carving lessons to a few colleagues after work, sharing not just techniques but stories and even a few quiet laughs. He found himself speaking up more, offering suggestions, not fearing judgment but simply contributing. He was still Vernon, quiet and dependable, but the stoicism had a new, softer edge, like perfectly sanded walnut. One afternoon, over coffee, Mike confessed his own